The first sign that something was different about this strike was not the launch detection, it was the spacing. I have spent enough years watching Iranian missile activity to recognize that what they had been doing in previous engagements followed patterns that, while operationally meaningful, reflected constraints the Iranian command had been working within rather than choices it had been making freely. Limited launcher inventory, limited missile stockpiles, a targeting concept that had to husband its assets across multiple potential engagements. Those constraints produced launch sequences with characteristic spacing, characteristic salvo sizes, characteristic gaps between waves. The launch detections that began arriving at the Israeli Air Defense Coordination cells in the early hours of this engagement did not have those characteristics. The spacing was wrong. The salvo sizes were wrong. The geographic distribution of the launch sites was wrong. And the implication, which the duty officers reading the picture were beginning to understand within the first 10 minutes, was that the constraints had changed. Whether through stockpile growth, through external supply, or through a deliberate strategic decision to expend reserves the Iranian command had previously been preserving, the inventory underwriting the engagement was substantially larger than the threat assessments that had been shaping Israeli defensive planning. I want to be clear about what I am going to do in the time we have, because the framing of this engagement is going to produce commentary that I do not think serves the analysis the situation deserves. I am not going to tell you that the Israeli Air Defense Network has been defeated. It has not been. The Israeli Air Defense Network remains, in absolute terms, one of the most capable layered air defense architectures in the world, operated by some of the most professionally disciplined crews any military has fielded, supported by an industrial base whose responsiveness has been demonstrated repeatedly across this campaign. What I am going to do is describe what happened to that network across the engagement, why it happened, and what the broader implications are for the entire category of layered air defense as a concept. Because the lesson of what happened is not specific to Israel. It is specific to the relationship between layered air defense and saturation strike at scales that the doctrine underwriting layered air defense has not historically been required to confront. Israel is, in this engagement, the test case. The lesson belongs to every alliance partner that has been organizing its air defense planning around the same doctrinal assumptions. Let me describe what the Iranian strike package actually consisted of, because the public framing is going to focus on the headline numbers in ways that obscure what the headline numbers actually mean operationally. 950 Shahab 3 class ballistic missiles is a figure that needs to be understood inside its operational context rather than as a raw count. The Shahab 3 family represents a particular category of threat. Medium-range ballistic, terminal phase velocities that put pressure on the aero engagement envelope, warhead masses that produce consequential damage against soft and medium hardened targets, and accuracy characteristics that have been improving across the period that Iranian missile development has been receiving sustained investment. 950 systems of this class launched against a single defending country in a single engagement represents an inventory expenditure that the Iranian command would not have undertaken without an operational concept that justified the expenditure. The concept, and I will return to this, was not destruction of Israeli targets. The concept was demonstration of a saturation capability whose existence would reshape every subsequent calculation about Israeli vulnerability to Iranian missile pressure, regardless of how much damage the specific engagement actually produced. The cruise missile component was, in my professional judgment, the more sophisticated element of the package, and the element that produced the specific failures in the radar network that this engagement has now made visible. Iranian cruise missile inventories have grown across recent years through a combination of domestic production and external acquisition that the Western intelligence community has, I will say carefully, not always assessed with the precision the situation has required. The cruise missiles employed in this engagement were not the older systems that had characterized Iranian capability in earlier periods. They were a mix of more recent generations, with terrain-hugging flight profiles, electronic protection features, and targeting precision that placed them in a different category of threat than the Israeli radar network had been optimized to defeat in the volume the engagement produced. The principle that this engagement turned on, and that I want to name with the precision a Western audience trained in NATO air defense doctrine will recognize, is one that any alliance air defense officer should be able to recite from memory. A layered air defense system derives its operational effectiveness from two things working together: sensor coverage and engagement capacity. Remove either one, and the other becomes insufficient. A system with comprehensive sensor coverage and inadequate engagement capacity will see threats it cannot defeat. A system with adequate engagement capacity and degraded sensor coverage will have weapons available without the targeting information required to employ them effectively. The Israeli network had been designed with both variables in mind, with sensor coverage and engagement capacity sized to threat assumptions that, until this engagement, had been the operative assumptions inside which the architecture had been built. The Iranian strike package was specifically designed to push both variables outside the envelope those assumptions had defined, and to do so simultaneously rather than sequentially. The sensor degradation occurred through mechanisms that I want to describe carefully because the public framing is going to misrepresent them. The Israeli radar network covering the central and southern approaches is not a single sensor. It is an integrated arrangement of multiple radars at different frequencies, with different coverage envelopes supporting different elements of the defensive architecture. The integration is what gives the network its effectiveness, because no single sensor in any modern air defense architecture is sufficient to provide the full picture the engagement decisions require. The integration depends on the individual sensors continuing to operate at the performance levels they were designed for, on the data fusion systems that combine their outputs continuing to function at the throughput levels the engagement tempo demands, and on the communications infrastructure that distributes the fused picture to the engagement decision authorities, continuing to deliver the picture at the latencies the engagement timelines require. Each of these dependencies represents a potential failure point, and the Iranian strike package was designed to apply pressure to all of them. The ballistic missile component generated terminal phase debris signatures, decoy releases, and warhead separation events in volumes that consumed sensor processing capacity at rates the network had not previously been required to sustain. The cruise missile component generated low-altitude returns in numbers that forced the lower-frequency radars in the network to allocate processing capacity to track discrimination across a volume that had not been part of the original sizing assumptions. The combination produced a sensor picture that was not, in any individual sensor's terms, beyond the sensor's technical capabilities. The picture was beyond the integration architecture's capacity to fuse, distribute, and present at the latencies the engagement decisions required. The radars were not blinded. The data fusion was not destroyed. What happened was that the integrated picture the architecture was designed to produce stopped being produced at the quality the engagement decisions required, and the engagement decisions began to be made on the basis of partial pictures rather than the integrated picture the doctrine assumed. This is what I mean when I say the radar network fell apart. The radars themselves continued to function. The architecture that turned the radars into a network ceased to function at the level the doctrine required. The distinction matters because the recovery from one of these conditions is a different problem than the recovery from the other. Now I want to describe what the engagement consequences were, because the consequences will be discussed in ways that I think obscure what the engagement actually demonstrated. Damage to Israeli targets was, by the standards a comparable engagement might have produced, contained. The interceptor engagements that did occur, executed by crews operating with the kind of professional discipline that the Israeli air defense services have demonstrated across this campaign, defeated a meaningful proportion of the incoming threats despite the sensor degradation. Casualties were lower than the strike package had been designed to produce. Infrastructure damage was significant in selected locations, but did not approach the catastrophic levels that the headline numbers might suggest were possible. By the metric of damage prevented per interceptor expended, the Israeli air defense network performed at levels that any honest professional assessment would describe as remarkable under the conditions it was operating in. I want that fact to be on the record before I describe what is also true and what the engagement has nonetheless revealed. What the engagement revealed, and this is the part that should concern every NATO alliance partner whose air defense planning has been built on comparable doctrinal assumptions, is that the relationship between saturation strike capability and layered air defense has shifted in ways that the doctrine has not yet absorbed. The Iranian strike package demonstrated that an adversary willing to accept the cost of generating mass at the volumes the engagement produced can push a sophisticated air defense network into a degraded operating envelope across the duration required for the strike package to deliver its effects. The push does not require defeating the network in the traditional sense. The push requires only producing conditions in which the network operates below the performance levels its doctrine assumes for some operationally significant period of time. The Iranian command produced those conditions for a period measured in hours, and inside that window, the strike achieved effects that the Israeli defensive architecture, operating inside its designed envelope, would have prevented. The cruel geometry the Israeli Air Defense Command faced during the engagement is the geometry every air defense commander watching this engagement should be studying with the seriousness it deserves. Conserve interceptors against the possibility that the engagement was only the first wave of a longer campaign, and accept higher leakage of incoming threats during the current engagement. Expend interceptors aggressively to defeat the maximum number of threats in the current engagement and accept reduced inventory for the subsequent engagements that the strategic situation suggested would follow. Neither option restored the variable that had been surrendered, which was the integrated picture that allowed efficient interceptor allocation in the first place. Whatever choice was made would be the wrong one inside the framework the doctrine provided, because the framework had been built for engagements that operated within sensor and engagement envelopes that the current engagement was exceeding. The decisions made under those conditions were professional, were defensible on the merits, and were nonetheless made in territory the doctrine had not adequately prepared the commanders to occupy. I want to address something that the Western analytical conversation will need to confront in the days following this engagement, and I will say it with the directness that 30 years of working with Allied air defense systems has taught me to say uncomfortable things. The assumption that has been underwriting NATO air defense planning across the post-Cold War period is that the threat environment we are planning against is bounded by the magazines our adversaries can affordably field and the technical capabilities their inventories can produce. This assumption was, for an extended period, reasonable. It is no longer reasonable, and the engagement this week has made the unreasonableness of it visible in ways that the institutional planning conversations are going to have to absorb whether they want to or not. Iranian capability to generate strike mass at the volumes demonstrated in this engagement is not a unique Iranian capability. It is a capability that any state actor with comparable resources and comparable willingness to invest can develop, and several state actors are developing it. The implications for the air defense planning of NATO partners, including the United States, are not theoretical. They are operational, and they are arriving on timelines that the institutional planning processes have not been calibrated to address. I want to be specific about the partners whose situation should be examined most carefully in light of this engagement, because the lesson does not distribute evenly across the alliance. The forward deployed forces in Eastern Europe, particularly in the Baltic states and in Poland, are operating air defense architectures sized for threat assumptions that the Russian operational situation has been continuously revising upward. The threat that has been growing in that theater shares structural features with the Iranian threat that produced this engagement, including increasing inventories of relatively cheap precision strike systems, increasing capability to combine ballistic and cruise threats in saturation packages, and increasing willingness to expend the inventories in ways that the magazine assumptions of NATO planning had not been sized for. The defensive architectures protecting those deployed forces have been improved across the campaign, but have not, in my professional judgment, been improved at the rates the threat development has been requiring. The gap between what those architectures were designed to defeat and what they are now potentially required to defeat is widening. And the engagement in Israel this week should be understood as a preview of what a comparable saturation strike against deployed NATO forces might look like. The European partners whose national air defense architectures cover their own territory face a different version of the same problem. Most NATO European air defense architectures have been sized for legacy threat assumptions that the current threat environment has been outpacing. The investment required to bring those architectures up to the standard the current threat requires is significant, and the political conditions in the contributing countries have not produced consistent willingness to make that investment at the scales the situation requires. The engagement this week should, in any institutional planning environment, functioning at the level the situation deserves, accelerate those investment decisions. Whether it will is a different question, and the answer to that question will depend on factors that the operational situation cannot itself resolve. The American Homeland Air Defense architecture is the case I want to address last, because it is the case where the implications are most uncomfortable. The United States has been, across the post-Cold War period, the alliance partner that has invested most consistently in air defense capability and that has fielded the most sophisticated architectures. The American architecture is, in absolute terms, superior to most of the alliance architectures that depend on it for support. The American architecture has nonetheless been sized for threat assumptions that, in my professional judgment, no longer adequately describe the threat environment the architecture may be required to confront. The growth in adversary capability across the categories this engagement demonstrated has been moving faster than the American planning conversation has been willing to acknowledge. And the assumption that the Homeland Air Defense architecture provides the defensive depth the strategic posture has been assuming is one that the engagement this week should prompt serious institutional examination of. The doctrinal lesson I want every Alliance air defense officer to absorb from this engagement is one I will state with the precision the situation requires. The era in which layered air defense could be assumed to defeat the threats it was designed to defeat is ending. Not because the architectures have become less capable, but because the threats have grown in ways that the original sizing assumptions of the architectures did not anticipate. The response to this situation is not despair. The response is honest examination of the assumptions underwriting current planning, honest assessment of the gap between those assumptions and the current threat environment, and honest investment in the architectural improvements that would close the gap. None of that is easy. All of it is necessary. And none of it will be undertaken seriously unless engagements like the one in Israel this week force the institutional conversations to confront what the operational situation has been demonstrating for some time. I want to give the Iranian planners their due, and I will do so with the same care I extended to comparable assessments during my service. The strike package was operationally sophisticated. The timing reflected genuine understanding of Israeli air defense doctrine. The composition exploited the seams in the architecture in ways that required serious intelligence preparation. The willingness to expend the inventory at the volumes the engagement required reflects a strategic calculation whose specifics I do not pretend to fully understand, but whose effect on the regional balance is going to be substantial. None of this is praise. The political character of Iranian conduct and the moral weight of the threat to Israeli civilians are matters that the professional military assessment does not adjudicate. What the professional military assessment can say is that the Iranian command demonstrated in this engagement a level of operational capability that the Western analytical conversation has been underestimating. And the underestimation has consequences that are going to propagate through the alliance planning conversations across the coming period. The assumptions that died across this engagement are worth naming with the precision they warrant. The assumption that magazine depth on the attacker side could be relied upon to constrain strike scale within the engagement envelopes the defender's architecture was sized for. The assumption that the integration architectures supporting layered air defense networks were sufficiently robust to maintain their integrated picture under saturation pressure of the scales that emerging adversary capabilities can now generate. The assumption that the doctrinal frameworks developed across the post-Cold War period continued to describe a threat environment that the current strategic situation has been substantially reshaping. And the deepest assumption, the one that underwrites a great deal of alliance planning across multiple domains, that the qualitative superiority of Allied systems would continue to compensate for adversary quantitative growth across timelines the alliance planning conversation could absorb without requiring uncomfortable institutional adjustments. The recovery work in Israel is underway this morning. The repair crews are working on the damage. The interceptor production lines are operating at maximum tempo. The crews at the batteries are debriefing the engagement with the discipline that distinguishes Israeli air defense from many of its peers. The intelligence services are processing what the engagement revealed about Iranian capability and Iranian intent. The political conversation in Jerusalem is sorting through the implications for Israeli posture going forward, and the conversations between Jerusalem and Washington are sorting through the implications for the broader American support architecture. None of this work will reach conclusions in the immediate aftermath. All of it will shape the regional and alliance situation across the months that follow, and the shaping will be more consequential than the engagement itself. The question I am left with, and it is the question every alliance air defense officer should be sitting with this morning, regardless of which theater his architecture covers, is not whether the Israeli network failed. The question is whether his own network, against a comparable strike package sized for his theater, would perform differently in any way that the underlying doctrine would justify confidence in. When was the last serious examination of the sizing assumptions underwriting his architecture? When was the integration capacity of his network last tested against saturation pressure at the volumes the current threat environment is capable of generating? And if the answers to those questions are uncomfortable, what is he doing this morning to ensure that the discomfort is converted into the institutional adjustments the situation requires, rather than absorbed into the planning processes in the way that comparable discomforts have been absorbed across the years that produced the gap this engagement has now made visible?